Oh, hey, everybody. So, obviously, I'm not here right now. Well, I mean, I'm here in that I recorded this at one point and I was in this physical time and space when I recorded it. But at the time that you're hearing it, I'm not here because I'm on a boat. I'm somewhere. My brother-in-law got married. I did that wedding. At exactly when I'm speaking these words, I don't know that it went well. I'm guessing though that it did. So I'm just going to say, hey, it went well. Awesome. And I'm on a boat now because they got married on a boat. So I'm currently on a boat and speaking to you through a recording. So welcome to Ashland Christian Church. There's so many places you could have chosen to be. You chose to be here. So that's cool. That's good. I'm glad you're here. And speaking of boats, one night Jesus was on a boat with his disciples. They were traveling just all night. And look, that wasn't a big deal. It's not a big deal for Jesus to be on a boat, not a big deal for Jesus to be with his disciples, because Jesus' disciples, as it turns out, at least a good chunk of them, were fishermen. They lived their lives on a boat. They were like when they were kids, they were thrown on a boat and taught to do boat stuff. And, they grew up fishing. And then when they became adults, they went into business as fisher people. And that's just what they did. And so being on a boat is not a big deal for them. It's not a thing they're worried about. It's nothing that should be out of the ordinary, nothing that, should be dramatic at all. And yet, on this night, it was really quite dramatic. Jesus does what he does. He went to go to sleep and, get a good night's sleep. And the disciples who were fishermen took over the boat, and the other disciples were hanging out. And they were riding along, and it was going, driving. I'm not totally sure what you do on a boat, ride or drive. Those are weird words. But they're on the boat, and they're traveling, and this storm out of nowhere just hits the boat. It just hits everything. Now, again, these are fishermen. They should understand what a storm is. They should understand how to deal with a storm. And yet this particular storm was just insane. It was crazy. I mean, just the waves were everywhere and water was coming in on the boat. And I mean, they really thought this is going to be the end. This is it. This is going to, we're going to sink and everything's going to be a real problem. So the disciples go and they wake up Jesus. And they're kind of annoyed with Jesus, to be honest. Like it's not just that they wake him up, it's that they don't understand why he's sleeping. Like, all hell is breaking loose on this boat. They are literally thinking they're going to die, and Jesus is just sleeping soundly. And so they don't just go to Jesus and say, hey, could you help? They go to Jesus and say, why are you not concerned with us drowning? Why are you being fine with us dying here? Why are you not helping? They're very, agitated and stressed out because it's such a terrible situation. Jesus, though, is a lot less stressed out. He does not actually think that this is a big deal, and so he calms the storm miraculously. He stops everything, which is wonderful. It's nice. That's the miracle. That's the headline of the story. But then he tells his disciples, "Hey, why are you so afraid? Why do you guys not have faith?" So that's the story of Jesus, calming the storm, the very famous miracle. I preached on this, 6 months ago or so. We had a whole conversation about Jesus' mastery over creation and being the Lord of all things. And I enjoyed that sermon. I hope you guys did too. But that's just one of a bunch of lessons we can learn from this. I mean, this is one of those stories that, if we're good and honest, you could learn a lot of different lessons from Jesus, calming the storm and the disciples, not having enough faith or whatever it is. There's just a lot we can learn. But I think for me, no matter what lesson we may try to apply or what lesson we may try to learn from this, I think there's a really good question that we should ask. And that question is very simple. Jesus is able to calm the storm, right? Which means, he can do that because he's God, and he can do that because he has the ability to do anything. So the question that needs to be asked is very simply, why did the storm show up at all? Like, why did Jesus, before he laid his head on the pillow, just decide, hey, I'm going to use my God powers to make sure that no storms happen, so that way I can get a good night's sleep and everything will be fine? Like, why not do that? Why not prevent the problem in the first place, specifically when we know that he can and does solve the problem? Like, when you think about it, all the storm is a problem. It's a problem. It's a bad thing that the disciples can't handle, but Jesus can. So if you've got this bad thing the disciples can't handle, but Jesus can, why not just remove that from the equation, not have the problem at all, and then have a good night? Why not? Of course, there's answers to that, potentially. There's absolutely potential answers. So maybe, for example, Jesus wanted to teach the disciples a lesson. Maybe there was something in the stress and the pain and the fear and the anxiety and the hard work. And, they're doing everything they can, but they can't stop the storm and they can't, fix the boat and they can't, maybe there's something in that, right? Maybe there's something there that is meant to teach them a lesson. Pain is a very good teacher. Bad things happening in our lives are very often things that teach us a lot of different lessons. And so maybe there was a lesson here. That could absolutely be it. Or maybe actually Jesus trusted them. Again, they're fishermen. We just said that. They're fishermen. They should understand exactly, what to do. They should be able to navigate the waters. They should be able to do all the stuff. Maybe Jesus simply trusted them to be able to handle it. And they freaked out and they didn't trust themselves, right? So maybe this whole scenario was Jesus going to sleep soundly, and in his mind, there isn't a problem because he knows that the disciples who are fishermen are able to handle any situation. And when they freaked out, when they got scared, that was them freaking out and getting scared when they shouldn't have been. Maybe that's it. Maybe that's the answer to this whole thing. Or maybe this whole thing's a test, We read from, one of his disciples later on, John, the disciple that he loved. He writes that perfect love casts out fear. So maybe Jesus has been teaching them all about love and teaching them all about God and teaching them all about different things. Maybe by giving them a scary situation, he's giving them a chance to practice their faith. Maybe this was a test, and maybe that test would help them down the road to pass other situations, Maybe that's what this is. And Jesus says, hey, why don't you guys have faith? Maybe it's because they failed the test. Actually, the story tells us that the disciples were even more afraid of Jesus than they were the storm. If it's a test, they failed miserably. But it's entirely possible that it was a test, and Jesus wanted them to have this test. The fact is, I don't know. I have no idea why Jesus doesn't prevent the storm. But what I definitely know for sure is that Jesus did not prevent the storm. That's what I know for sure. And of course, we know that Jesus is teaching us who God is. That's kind of the core of who Jesus is. Aside from anything else, Jesus' primary function, the first thing he does, first and foremost, is Jesus shows us God, right? He is the way, the truth, and the life. He is the one showing us how to get to God and who God is, because none of us have ever seen God, but if we see Jesus, now we've seen God, right? That's basically Jesus 101. And so what Jesus is teaching us in this story is that God doesn't prevent our problems. Of course, you know that. If you ever had a problem, and if you're a human person who exists, you've had problems. So we already know that God doesn't prevent our problems. God doesn't stop bad things from happening, disease or accidents or tragedies or broken relationships or whatever. God doesn't prevent those things from happening. He could, sure, but he doesn't. And so I don't know why. I can probably say the same thing we just said about the disciples. Maybe, there's a lesson to be learned from our pain, or maybe he trusts us to handle it and he's saying, hey, you're way stronger than you think you are. Or, maybe it's all a test and sometimes we pass the test and sometimes we fail the test, but there's just all these tests. I don't know. I have no idea. But what I know is that God does not prevent our problems. And that leads us to a conversation about one of Jesus' friends whose name was Lazarus. Now, we don't know exactly why Jesus was friends with Lazarus or how or when. All we're really told is that Jesus is very good friends with Lazarus and Lazarus' family. He had two sisters named Mary and named Martha. Lazarus and Mary and Martha are friends with Jesus. I get the impression, just a total aside to any sermon, anything I'm trying to teach you, I think they were probably friends before his ministry. It's entirely possible that they became friends through the ministry. We don't know, but they're close. And so one day Jesus gets this information. He gets this, this messenger shows up. And the messenger says that Lazarus is really, really sick, right? That he's sick and he's close to death. Now, look, Jesus is, there's no one that Jesus teaches or talks to that are normal. I said that badly. Let me back up. Jesus doesn't treat anyone just like a normal person, is what I'm saying. Everyone Jesus talks to is special. Everyone Jesus talks to, he gives his attention to, his full attention. He sees them, right? That's one of the things about Jesus that's amazing is no matter who it is, and it doesn't matter whether you're a religious leader or a tax collector or, a woman who's had, a disease forever, you're a little kid, it doesn't matter. Jesus sees everybody. But even still, Jesus has friends, Jesus has people that are more special to him than other people because Jesus is a person. And of course he does. We all have that. Lazarus was one of those special people. And Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, were also some of those special people. The expectation then that you would have to find out that Lazarus is sick, Lazarus is dying, Lazarus has this problem, the expectation that we would have is that Jesus would rush to his friend's side and fix it, right? Because why wouldn't he? They're friends. He can do it. In fact, what we know of Jesus, what we see of his other miracles, he doesn't actually even need to rush anywhere. He can just, say, be healed or snap his fingers, or I don't know what Jesus does, but Jesus is able to heal from a distance. Jesus does that with other people. So he doesn't actually even need to do anything about this. He can just fix the problem. And yet this is what we read in the Gospel according to John. It says, when Jesus heard about it, meaning Lazarus being sick, he said, Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. So although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. Now, again, Jesus could have fixed this, and yet the text tells us that he does nothing. For 2 days, he does nothing. He just stays put, guaranteeing that nature will take its course. And of course, Jesus told his disciples it's not going to end in death, and that's great. But we should really set that aside because he told his disciples that. He said it, but Mary and Martha don't know that. Lazarus doesn't know that. Nobody else knows that. And as it turns out, I think the disciples probably forgot about it pretty quickly because after a couple days, they end up traveling. He goes to check on Lazarus, and they go, and sure enough, Lazarus is dead. And so Jesus presented a problem, and he chooses to not prevent it. The problem is Lazarus is going to die if you don't intervene. Jesus doesn't intervene. He could have prevented Lazarus' death, and he doesn't. And that leads us to, Jesus meeting the sisters. This is what we read happens further. This is after they decide to go. Read once again the next part of the Gospel according to John says this. When Jesus arrived in Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in his grave for 4 days. Bethany was only a few miles down the road from Jerusalem, and many of the people had come to console Martha and Mary in their loss. When Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him. But Mary stayed in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. Okay, so before we go anywhere else, I just feel like I need to offer this disclaimer. We're now in our 7th week of our series called Remember Pluto, and we've been talking about people for the last 7 weeks now who are wrong. And we tend to think, the whole Pluto illustration, your first week here, we're talking about how everybody believed that Pluto was a planet, and then we found out that it wasn't a planet, and then people still said that Pluto was a planet, and people were teaching that Pluto was a planet even though when we knew it wasn't. And basically, if we remember Pluto, what we mean is we remember that we're all wrong. And we think about that as a bad thing. And it is. To a degree, it's, being wrong is not ideal. We would rather be right in what we say and think and be and believe and all that, of course. But I wanted to end with this because I want us to understand something really, really key and really important. There's a difference between being obstinate and being stubborn and being defiant and being Martha. Martha's wrong. We're going to get to that in a couple minutes, okay? Put a pin there. Martha's wrong. We'll come back. But Martha's not wrong because she's trying to be wrong. She's not wrong because she's being defiant. She's not wrong because she is being rebellious. She's not wrong because she's she wants her way instead of God's way. She's wrong because she's a person and people get things wrong. That happens. And as it turns out, what we need to understand and what we have to say out loud before we move on from this series is that when people are wrong, we should be gentle with people when they're wrong. When somebody has just made an honest mistake, coming in with a rebuke, being angry, being upset, yelling, I can't believe you did this, I can't believe you did that. Yeah, that's not helpful. And Martha is a beautiful example of that. And it's not just here. There's another story with Mary and Martha and Jesus, and it's actually helpful that we read this. This is what we read in Luke chapter 10. We're just going to read that whole story. This is really important to see how this all plays out. This is what we read in the Gospel according to Luke. It says, as Jesus and the disciples continued on their way to Jerusalem, they came to a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. Her sister Mary sat at the Lord's feet, listening to what he taught. But Martha was distracted by the big dinner that she was preparing. She came to Jesus and said, Lord, doesn't it seem unfair to you that my sister just sits here while I do all the work? Tell her to come and help me. But the Lord said to her, my dear Martha, you are worried and upset over all these details. There is only one thing worth being concerned about, and Mary has discovered it. It will not be taken away from her. Now, if you have a sibling, this story should speak to you on a spiritual level. If you've ever had a roommate who doesn't do their fair share, this should speak to you on a spiritual level. Mary and Martha lived together. And we got to understand, when we say that Jesus is coming for dinner, we have to realize that that is an ordeal. You think you want Jesus to come to dinner. You do. But that's until you realize what's going on. It's Jesus plus 12. Like, you might invite people and expect a plus 1, but with Jesus, it's a plus 12 at the very least. However, what we also know is that there's other times when we're told that women are following Jesus also. And that is, I don't know, a group of women. There was like 3 or 4 mentioned at one point, that are always with them. And so that's getting another one. So now we're up to, plus 12. Now it's up to 15 or 16. But then you also, there's one time where Jesus has like 72 disciples. And I'm not saying Jesus often traveled with 72 people. I'm just saying there was one time he had 72 disciples. And if you were trying to feed Jesus and his disciples on that day, you were feeding Jesus plus 72. Like, feeding 73 people is a lot of people. No matter what's going on, this is more than just your friend comes to dinner, is what I'm trying to say. To feed Jesus means you're feeding 13, 14, 15, 16, 18, 20 people. It's a big ask of anyone to do that. And if you're Martha, and Jesus is here because he's your friend, and you want to support him, and you want to you love him, and he's your teacher, and you know what he's doing, and you fully support what he's doing, and all you want to do is give him this nice night and this nice meal, makes sense that she'd be running around like a chicken with a head cut off. It was sort of like cooking for Thanksgiving. If you've ever prepared a Thanksgiving meal, you're starting at like 7 a.m. to eat at 3. It's like that, but with Jesus. And Martha thought that Mary would help, probably because Mary usually helps. But in this case, Mary's not helping. And so Martha goes to Jesus because they're friends. And is like, hey, mate, help me out. Look how lazy my sister's being, She's not wrong. I just can't stress enough. Mary is not being helpful. But where she is wrong is that, they could have eaten anything. Jesus could have fixed dinner himself without a lot of effort. We see that in some miracles. Worrying about dinner was the second most important thing to worry about. After worrying about what Jesus is teaching, Mary is listening to Jesus teach. And that is so much more important. What's amazing about this passage, though, is the way that Jesus corrects Mary. Nope, Martha. The way that he corrects Martha. Martha complains and shows that she's wrong. But Jesus says, my dear Martha, you are worried and upset over all these details. He could have said, Martha, you idiot, what are you talking about? He could have said, Martha, why do you not have any faith and your priorities are all out of whack? He could have rebuked her in front of everybody and, yelled at her and humiliated him. He could have done all sorts of things that people do. But that's not what Jesus does. Jesus understands it's an honest mistake. And it's a mistake born of good intentions. Martha wants to help. She's just helping wrong. And so Jesus is kind and he's gentle. And he doesn't tell her she's not wrong. I mean, he says, I'm not going to tell Martha anything. Martha can sit and listen all she wants, but he corrects her gently, kindly, and lovingly. And there is so much for us to learn. We've spent 7 weeks talking about how we are wrong and how other people are wrong. It is so important to realize that we need to be gentle with other people and we need to be gentle with ourselves, because that's the way Jesus was with people who were wrong. And so that's Martha. That's the story with Martha. But see, when Martha talks to Jesus about Lazarus, to get back to where we started, Martha's actually just as wrong there as she was before. Because she said to Jesus, Jesus, if you had been here, Lazarus would not have died. If you'd have been here, this problem would have been prevented. And the fact of the matter is, there's no evidence for that. There's absolutely no evidence that Jesus is walking around stopping people from dying. There is no evidence that Jesus is walking around preventing our problems or our pain or our difficulties or our anxieties. Jesus did not prevent the storm from coming. He didn't. And there's no evidence that had Jesus been there when Lazarus breathed his last breath, that Jesus would have stopped that. Martha was wrong to expect Jesus to prevent any bad from happening. And I think that the lesson for us then is we are also wrong when we expect God to prevent any sort of problem. Which, of course, begs the question, then what in the world kind of good is God? What good is God? And we got to answer that in 2 ways. The first thing we should understand is the rest of the story. I don't feel like I need to tell you the rest of the story, but let's go ahead and tell you anyway. Jesus brings Lazarus back from the dead. This is kind of like the cornerstone, biggest miracle of his ministry. And it's not just the biggest miracle because, it shows mastery over life and death and everything else. But this is what gets Jesus killed. We read in the New Testament that, the Pharisees are trying to kill Jesus, and some people over here want to kill him, and these people are arguing, and there's a lot of this. But after he raises Lazarus from the dead, they get united, and everybody's on board now with killing Jesus, because they realize that this is a miracle that nobody can cover up, nobody can deny, nobody can question. And the more people hear about this, the more they're going to follow Jesus. The more people follow Jesus, the more of a threat they are to the delicate balance of peace that the Pharisees in Rome had created in order that the people may be oppressed but not crushed. Short answer, this is what gets Jesus killed. But also, it's the most amazing miracle. And Jesus said it's not just something that happens with Lazarus. Jesus actually says that he is the resurrection and that he is the life, and that everyone who believes in him will also live, will also be resurrected. And what that means for us, and our first question we say, okay, what good is God, is this. Jesus didn't prevent the storm from coming, but Jesus does clear the storm. Jesus doesn't prevent Lazarus from dying, but he does bring Lazarus back. Jesus doesn't prevent bad things from happening in this world, but Jesus will, in time, eventually, when all is said and done, put everything back. That is the gospel, is the restoration of all things, putting back that which has been broken. And what that means for you and I as Christians is that when we trust in Jesus, we are trusting that in Jesus we will live after we die. That Jesus lived, died, and lived again through the resurrection, that we will live, die, and live again through the resurrection. And we can haggle over details all day, but the reality is, however it happens, the great hope of Christianity is that Jesus is the resurrection, he is the life, and we will live again after we die. So first and foremost, let's not lose sight of that. But that's when we die. Let's get a little more practical. More practically speaking, something odd happens. And it's not just me that thinks it's odd, or significant, rather. It's something odd, insignificant, and strange, and it's not just me. Ancient people who put the Bible together actually say they actually feel like it's that odd as well. This is what we read in further in the Gospel of John, once again, John 11. It says, when Jesus saw Mary weeping, and he saw the other people wailing with her, A deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. "Where have you put him?" he asked them. They told him, "Lord, come and see." Then Jesus wept. Jesus wept is 2 words. That's it. But the ancient people who looked at the Bible and divvied up the words, I'm not sure we've ever thought about this, but like the Bible is not written in chapters and verses. Other people came along later, looked at the story, said, okay, well, this chunk is this, and that chunk is this, and that chunk is this, and we'll put a heading here and chapter and verse. They looked at this and said, Jesus weeping is so significant. That is its own verse. Jesus wept as its own verse set apart from everything else. They saw that this is such an oddity. Why is Jesus weeping? You wouldn't think that Jesus weeps. And I'll tell you why you wouldn't think Jesus weeps. Because Jesus knows that he's going to bring Lazarus back from the dead like 5 minutes from now. Why weep? Why weep if you know there's a good ending? Furthermore, why weep if you understand the purpose for everything? That's the question we always ask. Whenever something hurts, whenever there is pain, whenever there is some sort of tragedy, some sense of whatever, we always say, why did this happen? How did this happen? What could we have done to prevent it? And here's the deal. We almost never know the answer to those questions. And very often we make a mess of things trying to, assign causation to things because we're just people and we don't know. But God knows. Because God knows everything. Jesus is God. Jesus knows why Lazarus dies. Jesus knows how it happened. He knows all the questions we ask. Jesus knows. One would think then, as we're all out here looking for the whys and the hows and everything else, looking for solace, that if Jesus knows the whys and the hows, then he would have solace as well. And yet, for maybe the last time in the series, this is when I say, we're wrong. We're all wrong about this. As it turns out, knowing why doesn't actually help to alleviate pain. It doesn't. It didn't with Jesus. He knows everything, and yet he weeps in pain. He's angry. He's frustrated. He's upset, and he weeps, even though he knows everything. We are as wrong as Martha was to say, well, why you would have prevented it, when we say things like, well, if we just could know why. Knowing why doesn't fix anything. But it does, in this story, Jesus weeping does teach us something really important. And here's what it teaches us. You see, we all have pets. If you don't have a pet, then go with me. Pretend you have a pet. When you go home, your pet's at home. You've got your cat, you've got your dog. Every time you're home, you've got a goldfish, you've got a whatever you happen to have, a snake, whatever. If you have pets, they are with you. And you can say, okay, well, they're with me. My dog is with me. My cat's with me. My whatever's with me. But here's the thing. They're with you, but when you suffer, they don't really suffer either because they're animals. They don't know. I think sometimes when we talk about God being with us, we think of God as sort of a pet, like God's with us, but he doesn't feel what we feel because how could he? He's God. He's different. We are as different from God as, your cat is from you, is the point. We're just different beings, different emotional levels, different whatevers. That's not true. When Jesus weeps, what he's showing us about God is this. God does feel what we feel. When we hurt, so does God. Which is to say this. God does not shield us from pain. I don't know why. It's a test. It's a lesson. He trusts us. Something else. I don't know. God does not shield us from pain. But neither does God shield himself from pain. And I imagine that whatever the reasons are for God not shielding us from pain are the same reasons why God doesn't shield himself from pain. I don't know. But I do know that when we say that God is with us, it's not God is with us like he's a service dog. We're going through the airport or going through Walmart or whatever, and the dog is with me. It's not that. When I say God is with us, when Jesus says God is with us, when the gospel is that God is with us, what we mean is that God experiences what we experience. God goes through this life with us. He doesn't shield us from things, but he doesn't shield himself either. And there's a certain degree of comfort that comes from that. Because the whole concept of Christianity is that we are a part of God and God is a part of us. The Holy Spirit is living within us. God is a part of us. And yet we are called in the Bible the body of Christ. We are part of God. Right? That's the whole unity thing. God is always with us and we are always with him. God is part of us and we are part of God. That's just how this works. But in this union, in this unity that we have with God, what we have to understand is it's a unity that is actually united. When we hurt, God hurts. When we suffer, God suffers. When we celebrate, God celebrates. When we're happy, God is happy. God goes through this with us. Jesus wept. And look, God knows there's going to be a good ending for us. God knows that we're going to live and die and live again, and yet we still weep. God knows that, that there's amazing things ahead of us, but the present time is difficult. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't change that, well, in the future it's fine. So right now, right here and right now, God is with us, and God suffers with us, and God hurts with us, and therefore God understands. And we can trust someone who understands. We can trust someone who's with us. And we can trust that God, because at the end of the day, we're wrong about so many things. But what we're right about is that there is a God who loves us, there's a God who cares for us, and there is a God who is guiding us through this life step by step, day by day, week by week, year by year, season by season, helping us to be the best we possibly can be and leading us towards a future of resurrection, of new life, of rebirth, where things are put right, even if they aren't now. And this morning, we are in our 7th week, our last week of our series called Remember Pluto. And we're talking about a woman who's a lot like a lot of us, a lot like, any of us, that we were wrong, but, at the end of the day, we're wrong for a good reason. We're trying. As we look at this woman, we learn a valuable lesson. That lesson is this. Our 7th lesson from Remembering Pluto is this. God does not prevent our pain. God feels it with us and holds on to us as we make it through it. God doesn't prevent our pain. Instead, God feels it with us and holds on to us as we make it through it. I'm so glad you guys came to church today. So glad you guys are here. We got musicians that are going to come sing a song. We offer an invitation each and every week. I'm not here to talk to you about that invitation, but I will be in a few days. So you can send me a message. You can do whatever. You can also talk to anybody who's physically present in here. If you've not made a decision, the Bible teaches we should repent to be baptized. Sounds like two things. It's just one. In repentance, we say, I want to do things God's way. I'm willing to change. I'm willing to be molded and shaped. And in baptism, we align ourselves with Christ. We join ourselves to Christ. Just as he was dead, buried, and raised in baptism, we are dead, buried, and raised. And that's a beautiful decision of union with Christ that promises us that we receive the forgiveness of sin and the gift of his Spirit. Never made that decision? Let's talk. If you're not a immersed believer in Christ, looking for a perfect church home, this is not it. But we do serve a perfect God. We want to connect. We want to call. We want to cultivate. Want to meet new people. Want to share the gospel. Want to grow up. But we do it. We want to understand that no matter what happens, that God is with us, that God feels our pain, that God is holding on to us as we move forward. And we don't have any other answers besides that, but that is enough. So as we stand, as this gets turned off, and as we sing.